Welcome to this Budget and Finance Committee meeting for October 16th, 2017. I'm Paul Krikorian. I'm joined by my colleagues, Mr. Bonin and Mr. Koretz, and we're ready to begin. Members, I would have recommended items 5 and 6 for consent approval, but I'm confident that we must have cards on them. So after we consider public comment, those matters will be recommended for consent approval unless there's questions or concerns. We will be hearing item number 7. And I think if that discussion is going to be brief, maybe we'll go ahead and do that before we go into closed session. But for now, let's go ahead and begin public comment on both general public comment and items on the agenda. So we'll go ahead and take Mr. Previn for his agenda items, 2 minutes plus 1 minute for general public comment, please. Can we do them separately? 2 minutes for agenda items, 1 minute for general public comment.
Thank you, sir. It's Eric Previn from Studio City and CD2, and you have a jam-packed agenda here. And I wanted to address item number 2 initially, which is Patrick Pascal, who's filed a complaint about an incident in January 2015. Now, what's amazing is when I read the complaint, there was no reference to him being on a bicycle. It was a trip and fall case where he had he'd hit a bad road. Now, obviously, we now know he was riding a bike. I'm just flummoxed by the fact that it only now appears in that way, and it didn't in a couple of the other spots, and I just don't understand it. And I do know that this is a very populated route for bicycling in Griffith Park, and they use it a lot. So evidently there's been some liability in Lambeth Street. I want to reference that we have had in the last 1 year over $20 million in claims against the city for bicycle-related injuries and such death. In the previous 10 years, we only had about 6 and change million. So something has dramatically changed. And we are not in a position, as you well know, facing judgment obligation bonds and other things, to underwrite, though we do not want people hurt and we want to protect them. And I would ask this body to get a motion going to investigate the possibility of requiring certain kinds of bicycle insurance, because these people, if they are hurt, need to be taken care of. I don't think that's in dispute. But what is in dispute is, can we afford it without then spending the $20 million we spent in the last 1 calendar year paying out to people, as opposed to fixing the various impediments to smooth sailing on our roadways. So that is super important. Item number 1 is about retaliation. And here, Mr. Englander, I know you're an expert in this area. We are featuring a retaliation on a regular basis to city employees who are forced to look as the council leadership asks ITA to reduce everybody to the size of #Blumenfield's nose. And we are facing Carlos Singer in the mayor's office, who is not giving records in defiance of the Public Record Act because they can. And this is a kind of torture of employees, and that's why I asked Vivian Swanigan. Is this my final minute? I'll just keep rolling.
This is general public comment.
Okay, so for the general public comment, I'll just pick up on what I said about retaliation, which is we need a better system than encouraging city employees who are good and faithful to simply look away from bad stuff. We need a model, not where everybody's grieving every 10 seconds and we're up in budget and finance with a lawsuit, but a model where people will not tolerate mistreatment of one another and of the workers. And I believe that it's possible if we change a few little details, like, it's under the category of transparency, isn't it, ultimately? When somebody walks in and says, hey, I'd like to inspect some records, and the employees go, the Carlos is not in right now, we can't, sorry. And then it goes on for days or weeks, they all feel like terrible, frankly. They feel terrible. They don't understand, why are we denying this guy? He's a writer, he's a member of the public, shouldn't we just show him the records? Just do as we say. And that creates a terrible situation, which I believe, sir, you're the expert on liability, creates an enormous liability. So I say we undo all those things I mentioned, and I'm just getting started, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Previn. Next up is Mr. Herman. 2 minutes for agenda items, 1 minute for general public comment.
So, incident number 1, Yao, Y-A-O, William, $3.5 million regarding a what? Bicyclist? How does that relate to what happened last week? Well, involving a bicyclist who lost control and fell due to defective infrastructure in the city of Los Angeles. Willits versus Los Angeles, How horrible can it get? Then we have a pedestrian accident that occurred on October 28, 2014 on the corner of Alvarado and Pico Boulevard. Another infrastructure incident involving a person's life. And then we go into the what? Oh no, look, the City of Los Angeles traffic accident revolving what? An incident in Balboa Boulevard and Burbank Boulevard. Who could that be? What moron has that district? And then we go into number 6. The motion of Krikorian relative to the transfer of funds for the purpose of conducting new development activities in connection with the Office of the Finance. I don't know shit, finance modernization program. Then, since we only get 2 minutes on every item, per item, let me go back now to the what? Claims of discrimination, retaliation, harassment. Well, I sure know what that's all about. Let's call LAUSD. I hear, Mr. Holmquist, you have a client who's filing a lawsuit? Yeah. What's the purpose of that? Discrimination. Well, why? Well, because he's a whistleblower. We don't like educators or whistleblowers. So what do you plan to do with them? Well, don't tell anyone, but we like fucking with them so that he could eventually
Speak
quit.
to the agenda.
I'm talking about discrimination harassment, how it relates to...
It doesn't speak to one of the agenda
Yes, it
items.
does.
Okay, his time is done. General public comment. 1 minute.
Now that I was rudely interrupted under the Brown Act, which no one here gives a fuck, like fucking Bonin, boycott, Peppa Pig playing on his cell phone, and the Goat Boy chair who interrupts you during general public comment for 1 fucking minute, 42 U.S.C. 1983, California constitutional rights violations, Bill of Rights violations, all these fucking violations, and we're paying out of the Yang Yang $1.6 million for public safety? Fuck you. And then we got the Divil Dwarf, fifth place pussy loser over there, who doesn't look at the public to display any action because he knows it's a fact of truth. Dated what? Identify the transfer of $1.6 million. No wonder why LA's fucking in a budget. Take all the pensions from everyone and pay up. Pay every lawsuit on this fucking bullshit agenda and fuck you.
Time has expired. I'd like to, well, first of all, before we go to the general public comment alone, members, I'd like to propose approval of items number 5 and 6 on consent, unless there's questions or concerns. Seeing none, that will be the action of the committee. Public comment is now, can we monitor our cell phones, please? Public comment is now closed on all agenda items. And I'm going to go ahead and, as a courtesy, rather than keeping her waiting, I'm going to ask Ms. Memzik to come up and offer her general public comment now before we go into closed session. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for hearing me. I'd like to bring to your attention that Vince Bertoni, your Director of City Planning, and some government employees under Mr. Bertoni is taking bribes. The California Penal Code 7(6), the word bribe signifies anything of value or advantage. California Penal Code 92 and 93 refers to every person who gives or offers a bribe. The reason this is so important is that California Code of Regulations 13055 says that you cannot, in the coastal zone, take money for litigation costs. However, Vince Bertoni is taking indemnification and reimbursement of litigation costs, and you're submitting them to the state of California. So you're asking state of California officials to launder your bribes. So you've got lots of layers of criminal activity in that. And I laid it out for you in a letter today. I only have 2 seconds left, so please look into it, pull those applications. It's on Earlham. You have 4. You have 2 on Corona Del Mar. You have 2 on Trino.
Thank you very much. We have copies of your letter. Your time's expired. Thank you very much.
Racketeering charges more
Your
than
time
5.
has expired, ma'am. Thank you. All right. With that, we are going to now proceed into closed session. And for the record, during Mr. Previn's comments, we are actually joined by Mr. Englander and Mr. Blumenfield, so we have a full contingent now, and we're going to proceed to closed session. All right, we are back now in open session, and we're ready to bring up item number 7.
Item number 7 is a motion by an Englander relative to an instruction of the Los Angeles Fire Department to report regarding the resources necessary to ensure the reliability of the automatic vehicle location system prior to its November 2017 launch date, and identify and transfer $1.6 million in funding for completion of this critical project. Public Safety Committee has waived consideration of this matter.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Scott Porter, the CIO for the fire department. I thought I'd start with just a couple of comments on the status of AVL and then answer any questions that you have. Just a quick history. About 2011, the fire department purchased equipment to outfit about 650 vehicles of our frontline vehicles with AVL, automated vehicle locator equipment. The intent at the time was to use the AVL devices to augment our dispatch services. Since then, we've been using it primarily to provide mapping in the MFC and the 911 center so that we can see the vehicles, but we haven't really implemented the full dispatch capabilities of AVL since then. So the equipment that's in place today was first put in around that 2011 timeframe. It's there now, and this year we've really been focusing on operationalizing what we have in terms of equipment, and that is primarily making AVL not only help us decide which units are closest to incidents, which is sort of the primary thing people think about for AVL, but also there's a lot of other intended benefits of AVL that have to do with resource management. For example, using AVL to know when resources are moving in a status where we wouldn't expect them to move. We use AVL to help us identify resources that might be in areas where they're moving between districts, trying to get back to their district, and we use AVL to pick them up for calls, closest calls. So we're looking at a lot of different ways to implement AVL. And the other thing that's important about our plan right now for AVL is that we're taking a very incremental and iterative approach, which means AVL is not sort of a one day you don't have it, the next day you have it. It's really something that we have in our kit, and we're starting to operationalize it, and we imagine that we're going to be using and changing it over time for quite a long period of time. Once we have it available to help us with the dispatch decision making, we envision making changes to it forever, much like we do with CAD today. We're constantly changing the algorithms and whatnot. In terms of our upcoming AVL implementation, we are planning an AVL implementation or an implementation which is a whole series of enhancements to the CAD system. That's going to happen in November. In that implementation related to AVL, we'll be focusing primarily on resource availability and resource management. And then we'll also be using AVL for closest unit dispatch on one particular algorithm, meaning one particular type of response. And what we hope to do in that case is to start to learn, once we actually fully operationalize AVL in that area, to learn from that and figure out what other types of responses we'll be using AVL for, where it's most appropriate. We certainly don't imagine today that one day we're going to turn on AVL for every type of response. There's certain responses where it makes a lot of sense to use AVL, and there's other types of responses where district boundaries still make sense. So we've actually designed a system over the course of the last year where we have each of the components of AVL pretty well separated, so we can make very fine-tuned adjustments to the different pieces of the AVL technology. So that's kind of where we are right now. That first implementation is happening in November, and then beyond November, we expect to continue to enhance and operationalize AVL.
Thank you. Mr. Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I submitted this motion back in August because I'd been hearing about AVL for a long time.
Yeah.
And since before I joined the council, fire department response times was a big issue.
Yes.
And the fire department's master plan for 2015 to 2017 lists this as a priority. It's mentioned in the mayor's cover letter in that report. I believe the mayor mentioned it in one of his State of the City speeches. Because right now, as I think you stated, we can be deploying what we think is the closest ambulance or engine company when it's actually, because it's not actually at the station.
That's correct.
We deploy based on where the station is, not where the actual unit is.
Correct.
And this was meant to address that and help us improve response times and save lives and,
Yes.
and property. I submitted the motion because I knew you were doing this rollout in November, but it was my understanding that that in the process of working with our tech partners, we had discovered some pretty significant errors that could cause us to be diverting folks to or calling folks from the wrong location or diverting them from the wrong location.
Yes. Well, we have been working with partners during our proof of concept to evaluate different technologies. During that, we have always known, because the original AVL equipment was installed in 2011, the initial rollout was really to just display these vehicles on a map. When you're a dispatcher working in a dispatch center and you see the vehicles on a map, it's hard for you to tell, is that AVL accurate? Are they operating? So we didn't really focus on that, the department didn't. We started to focus on that as we were developing this year. And what we already knew before this proof of concept and what this helped us to sort of zero in on was there's kind of two aspects to AVL that we have to be careful about. One is it on or off? Is the equipment in the vehicles actually functioning? So we have a process now to carefully evaluate that. We look at that every day. We look at whether or not it's on or off. And where it's off, we go and figure out, hey, is it off because it's been disconnected, because there was a malfunction, because the equipment, there's a number of reasons why it could be. The other thing that we're looking at carefully now, and as part of our initial rollout, we've started to make corrections for, is it accurate? So it could be on, but it could be reporting false data. So part of our evaluation and the work we did to sort of design the system that we're going to start implementing in November was to get a handle on both the state of it and the accuracy of it. So those are two things that we've been aware of for quite some time, but now we're focusing in on how much is that happening, where is it happening, and what can we do to correct it, either in real time as part of the systems that we're implementing or as part of some sort of correction we need to do the infrastructure.
Well, I was concerned that we would roll out a system like this if we don't know that the location is accurate.
Exactly.
That's pretty scary.
Yeah. So what we have today is we have a pretty high level of confidence based on the data that we're collecting. So the AVL is out there and it's giving us data every day. So these units are reporting data to us every day. We're assessing that data. Based on the data that we're seeing every day, the first question, which is it on or off? The state of it, we're pretty confident in. We look at sort of these 72-hour rolling windows, last 72 hours, we had almost in the fleet of 650 or so vehicles, almost no reports. And when we do get a report, it's usually isolated to a vehicle or two. In the accuracy questions, in our testing of this first algorithm, this first sort of, the piece that actually does the calculation of who's closest, when we look at that, we do have things in place today to start to throw out things where we think they're not accurate. And before we implement it, we're going to be looking at adjusting the software so that we can see the cases where it's not accurate. But part of it's not going to be perfect. We have a couple of fallbacks right now in terms of if we know that the data is not accurate, we're going to fall back to closest station location, which is what they're dispatching on today. And we're not implementing it for every algorithm. So part of our incremental approach is to begin to implement this so that we can start to collect the data about the accuracy.
Okay, so I submitted the motion because I understood this was happening in November. The location data wasn't going to be correct, and we needed to identify additional funds to correct the problem.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, Mr. Chairman, if I could call up Tom Scaramellino. He's with TeleGo. He's one of the tech partners who was alerting me to some of the issues with this.
Sure.
Tom, could you identify the problem and articulate what the error is?
Sure. First, thank you, Chairman Krikorian and council members. We have been working with Mr. Porter and his team since the beginning of the year. And frankly, I'd like to thank Mr. Porter because without his efforts and frankly without the efforts of this council funding the CIO position, we wouldn't be discussing AVL today. As you know, Assistant Chief Butler established and ran a task force in 2012 that made very clear that it's a critical priority in the emergency response of the city to be able to dispatch vehicles knowing their actual location. And we are still sitting here today without that capability in hand, and it's only because of Mr. Porter's leadership that we're even here addressing this issue. So I'd like to thank him for that. I'd like to thank Assistant Chief Butler for that. I'm the chairman and CEO of a local navigation and dispatch software provider. We primarily began working with the LAFD early this year in order to identify improvements to the dispatch system and the navigation and mapping systems as well. For instance, from surveys that the LAFD ran during the course of our project, about 40% of firefighters are still using paper maps, about 40% are using Google Maps, which the routes for which and the ETAs and the traffic lines are obviously not tailored for a vehicle with a siren on, and therefore not necessarily appropriate. And so we were identifying navigation and mapping solutions. During the course of this project, Mr. Porter and I worked together, and we identified some pretty critical issues with the new CAD system for AVL-based dispatch that's being addressed. And what we identified is that about 40% of the time in any dispatch event, and LAFD has over 500,000 dispatches per year, it's one of the largest and most active departments in the country, about 40% of the time a vehicle is located incorrectly. There's about 4 different causes for this issue, some of which is just urban canyons. You know, you're in an environment with tall buildings and GPS signal is poor. The most significant is what are called bit transmission issues, where a digit in the latitude or longitude will get flipped over the radio network. When this occurs, if it occurs in the singles or the tens digits of that latitude or longitude, the vehicle can be misaccurately identified as being in North Africa or deep in the Pacific Ocean. Those are relatively simple cases for the CAD software to handle. Unfortunately, when the latitude or longitude has an error in the 10th or the 100th decimal place, the vehicle will be inaccurately located within a 5 to 25 mile radius, which means you could send a vehicle to a 911 call, and then ultimately that vehicle actually is anywhere from 5 to 25 miles away, and you'll never know. Based on our analysis, a very conservative analysis, it's clear that under the current system, this will happen on the order of every few hours, which is obviously something that we absolutely need to address before we launch an AVL-based dispatch system. So we've been working closely with Assistant Chief Butler, with Mr. Porter, and with other members of the staff to be able to implement improvements on a relatively quick time frame to meet the city's goals of providing dispatch, knowing the actual locations of these vehicles, while minimizing error and building the most reliable CAD software possible to give citizens the response times that they deserve.
So, colleagues, this is why I submitted the motion, because to me this sounds like a pretty big problem that needs to be fixed. And the idea was to ask the LAFD and the CAO to help us identify the funds that are necessary to fix this.
Can I follow up based on?
Yes, absolutely.
On a critical point. How does that compare? Like, I go on my phone, and I'm a little baffled by this. I'm sure there's good reason, but I go on my phone, I hit find my phone, and I can see where my wife is and where my kids are based on their phones. And they've never been in North Africa or any of those places. I mean, it's never shown up that way. So how does this compare to something that's off the shelf, like Find My Phone?
Well, it's a quite, I don't know if that was addressed to me or Mr. Porter, but I think we both give the same answer, which is that, you know, using a GPS on a standard cell phone communicating over a cell network is just a very different operational environment than using the AVL on a radio network. That said, the hardware issues that we've seen are not uncommon. These are the types of hardware issues that are very common in a deployment like this. They just need to be handled properly by software.
Well, I mean, just help me with the very simplistic thought of, okay, we're spending millions of dollars on all this stuff. Why don't we just buy everybody an iPhone, stick it on their vehicles, and then press Find My Phone to know where they are, and then build the software in to integrate it there?
That is one of the error handling mechanisms Mr. Porter and I discussed. Yeah.
There is definitely something to what you're saying in terms of the technology. There's different types of technology that we're using, both for the AVL and for the CAD dispatch side. I guess I would just say, you know, the data that we learned through the proof of concept was actually on a very limited number of vehicles. Our initial implementation of AVL is really meant to help us to sort these things out, to figure out where investment is actually needed to make these corrections. We have a pretty high level of confidence right now in terms of both the state and the accuracy of the AVL, at least to initially roll this out. In terms of the 40% number, I'm not sure that we would totally agree with that number, only because of the data set that was analyzed and how the analysis was done. But be it what it is, we do think that there's going to be some errors, but we think also that the types of errors that we saw during the proof of concept and since then are errors that we're going to be at least identifying and correcting, and the fallback is to go back to where we are, today, which is the closest station.
Why are we reinventing the wheel with a 40% potential accuracy when we have a 99% accuracy, system that everybody in the world has access to?
Yeah, the issue primarily around using cell phone GPS data is that it's not always available. So if it's not available necessarily one day when you're looking at Find My Phone, it's sort of incidental. You don't really notice it. For us, the system has to continuously be available, has to have high availability and redundancy. So these types of errors might be occurring in your phone, not in your phone. We have to address them even if we have a phone-based system, which may be one of our alternatives for a backup system or a redundant system. I think the goal here is that we begin to implement AVL in a way that's reasonable and responsible. We collect lots of data and we start to learn from that data. That's really the approach, rather than trying to solve for this is the best solution and we have to have that solution before we implement any piece. So we are being cautious. We know what the risks are. We know sort of what the technical parts are, and we certainly are going to, the technology that we're using actually in the vehicle devices is very similar to the phone technology. So accuracy-wise, it's very similar, but it is susceptible to these errors. And, we're going to correct for those errors.
And just to be clear, the system that we've proposed here actually includes cell phone GPS assigned to a unit as a third redundant mechanism for location. So the first mechanism would be to identify the AVL and confirm in the software that it's actually an accurate reading. If so, the vehicle can be dispatched based on that reading. The second is to look for an AVL reading that we know, a sequence of AVL readings in the last 15 minutes that we know are accurate, and dispatch based on that. If those two first order mechanisms fail, cell phone GPS assigned to the vehicle is a third redundant mechanism. There are issues with cell phone GPS as well. This is why it's important to have a multi-layered software process where you have this error handling baked in to create the most reliable GPS reading possible when dispatching the vehicle. And we're very close to getting there, and frankly, being able to fund it and move forward is the biggest roadblock.
Mr. Krebs.
Well, obviously we know why this is important, especially in the case of heart attacks and places that are a little more distant, like Pacific Palisades. It might be 10 minutes from the station to a heart attack victim, which means they've got a high probability of death, or there could be somebody driving right past their block, and obviously they'd have almost a 100% chance of survival if they hopped out of the car a block away. So we know this is going to save potentially dozens, hundreds of lives if it's implemented perfectly, and obviously the quicker the better, because we're missing those opportunities every day the system is in place. I'm wondering if we also could have sort of a low-tech common sense backup where the vehicle that you're communicating with you can say, we have you as 2 miles away from this spot. If you believe this is inaccurate, let us know. And that could be, a click on something. That way, if they know they're in Granada Hills and you're trying to send them to Pacific Palisades, they don't just go because you sent them. There's some way to let them know how close you think they are and a quick way to respond so that those kinds of mistakes never happen. Because if there's a possibility of that happening, then we shouldn't be implementing this system, because we'll have some cases where the station would be much closer, and that's a life and death decision.
And that's part of the operational practice today. So today, part of the operational practice is, and remember too that these unit recommendations, the location of the vehicles, the distance of the vehicles, or the time, travel time or distance, is one part of a pretty complicated algorithm in most cases, right, of what the CAD does. Those decisions are made by CAD in sub-second time. And so they're made very quickly and rapidly. But part of the dispatch practice today is this verification of the units. Units will hear the broadcast on the radio. They'll say they're closer. They'll say they're further away. So I think your point is very well taken, is that there are fail-safes built into the current dispatch system. This is an improvement in CAD's ability to sort of make that first assessment. The other part of AVL that doesn't get talked about as much but was part of our proof of concept was the whole mapping component. So the ability for the units to have spatial and situational awareness while they're moving around and being assigned to incidents. So they can actually physically see where we think they are versus where they actually are and where the other units around them are. So that's another part of the enhancements that we'll be looking at going forward. It certainly is going to require funding. I think the message is that the first implementation of this has to be in a very reasonable and responsible way, and then we got to look at where we would identify the best value for any additional funding that we can identify going forward.
And just to follow on that, Mr. Porter's exactly right that the proposed implementation and allocation would for the first time provide first responders in the trucks with real-time vehicle tracking on the map. This way, if the dispatch is wrong, they can see other units, they can see where they are located as well, and they can determine who might actually be able to solve that problem through some sort of human inspection or human QA, right?
Okay. So if I may, sorry, but this is starting to sound like we're going through a bidding process a little bit for a contract. So thank you. No, I don't mean any offense by that. It's just that you're telling us the benefits of your system. It's great. We appreciate your hearing it. I think the direction that we are kind of, well, I shouldn't offer any suggestion of our direction, but what I'm hearing from the fire department is this is continuing work in progress. There have been advances made. The November rollout is sort of soft in that there's rollouts that have happened before. It's a continuing process. We're learning from these experiences each step of the way. This may be, the proposal might be part of a solution. There are other potential solutions that there may be. There are differences in cost effectiveness among them. There are differences in how we might be able to operationalize these different solutions, all of which I think what I'm hearing from everybody here is we have a sense of urgency about getting done. And I hope that that's shared by the department.
100%, yes.
And I think, so what I would suggest is that we get this report back that's requested in the motion. Just set a time frame? No. But we get a report back, 30 days? With recommendations, with sort of a more robust report that you just summarized about status of the AVL, and maybe some recommendations about potential funding that may be necessary. I don't know if it's 1.6. I don't know if it's more or less than that. I don't know what the right solution is going to be yet in order to start appropriating money. But if we can get that report back quickly and to public safety as well. And sorry, Mr. Englander, I don't know if you want to weigh in at this point. I was kind of saving you for cleanup, but go ahead. Go right ahead. No, I think I'm done. The report should include those other factors as well, but go right ahead.
But if you want to go clean up, I'll ask my quick question, or I'll after you. My question is sort of a blunt one, which is asking for looking for $1.6 million because we need to fix the system. The question is simply, was there, why is it broken? Why are we so inaccurate? And is it the contractor's responsibility or liability? I mean, I mean, we're kind of dancing around it, but was there a problem? Did somebody not do their job right? I don't mean to point the finger, but it seems crazy to me that we're 25 miles off in this day and age. I'm having trouble processing that, so I'm just putting it out there as a blunt question.
Yes.
And I think we'd like to see that in writing when the reports come back.
Yeah.
A history of what led to the inaccuracies. So if I could add to that,
please
make sure that we get that's included in the report.
And is there somebody that's liable? I mean, besides us.
Can I just? I'm sorry. Can I just answer that quickly?
Sure.
Remember, today we don't have AVL for dispatch, so it wouldn't be fair to say today's dispatch system is inaccurate by X percentage, because today's dispatch system is as accurate as it can be when we assume the units are in quarters. That's how it's been for ever, as far as I know. What we're talking about is taking technology that was purchased sometime in 2011 and since then, operationalizing it and using it to augment or enhance the dispatch decision-making. What we're finding before we implement it is we're trying to understand how do members use the mapping in the field and how accurate is the availability of the information that we have. That's where we are now, so I just want to make sure that...
But if it's not accurate and it
Right.
doesn't work,
and
that's potentially somebody's fault.
And that's where I'd like
Maybe not, but
I totally appreciate that. That's where I'd like to come back with a report to talk about what we think the accuracy is of the system today with no further investment. What we have actually in our budget now is to begin implementing and making the changes that we need to connect what we have to the CAD system. What I think what the council member is proposing is if we need additional money to address these additional things, that's your proposal. And I think that's fair enough, but this initial implementation is going to go a long way to tell us where do we need that, if we need it, and where do we need it, and where should that be spent. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, I'm glad you did. It's helpful. So in taking a step back, I mean, I've been a proponent for years of AVL, and I think I shared it last when we first started having this discussion a number of years ago, that I myself am an implementer of it, and not cellular, but GPS-based. And I, in fact, just pulled up exactly where my daughter's car is parked, to the exact parking spot, which has always been accurate, and it's not cellular. It's installed as a GPS vehicle locator system. It's off-the-shelf software, from what you were saying as well. Yep. And we're by far not the first city to implement. In fact, we're probably pretty late to the dance in terms of being a large city that doesn't have vehicle locator systems. And we're starting to put some of that in our tracking software on black and whites. Hollywood is the first division, in fact, that has it. And it'll tell a lot more than where the vehicle is, but hopefully if you can include in your report what other information is available with the system we're putting in. Speed, direction, is it sort of a black box recorder from that perspective? Because that'll help on liability and all the other things, including maintenance logs. A lot of those have those as well. So what are the features that are included in the vehicle locator systems? Also, when we've started implementing this, because the city is so slow in implementing any technology, when we start off, and this was a number of years ago, the space has probably changed dramatically, I would imagine. And for that matter, not only does it probably do a lot more, typically the prices come way down. And so the real question also is, are we trying to catch up with older technology? So I think that should be included in the report. On the back end for the dispatch systems, is what does that connectivity look like? What's left to do? So if you can spell that out. And then has ITA been brought into this? Have you been working with Ted Ross specifically, or?
We work with ITA because in the dispatch arena, how we're planning on implementing. So first of all, you know ITA supports our radio system.
Right.
So
right.
They have been involved in terms of they maintain, we just finished a large upgrade, which was sort of a prerequisite to implementing AVL, large upgrade of our mobile data system. So the radio system that does our data.
The backbone system.
The backbone.
Yeah.
So they're involved, as our partner in all the radio backbone.
Well, they're actually not, though. They're involved in the maintenance. They're actually never ever brought to the table at the beginning of the conversation. I'll just be honest. I mean, it should be that way. You're right. So they are involved, absolutely hands-on, but afterwards in terms of maintenance and operations, but not procurement, installation, vendor issues. They're often not. My experience is they're not brought in.
I'm referring to the MDC project, and I'm not meaning to debate you here, but they're a partner at the table from the beginning of the and they've been a great partner.
Good.
And they've been really good at helping us spec the equipment, manage the equipment. So all of the sort of issues around the radio system, they've been a great partner.
Okay.
I just want to.
And on the AVL side of it?
Absolutely, because this whole system, the whole infrastructure is based on their system. And also working with the vendor that's doing our upgrade of our mobile data computers. Those mobile data computers are coming with new AVL chips. So there's a lot of pieces that we depend on them for, quite honestly.
Sure. Okay. Well, I would ask that if they be included in the report as well, And I would ask that the report come back to both committees. Very interested to see sort of where we're at. But if you can remember to include what are the latest technologies in the space and the list of features and specifications on what this technology does. And I think it's a good conversation, and it's an important one, because where this really got to all of us is, and we have a lot of incidents, but it was one particular one that I'll never forget, where 2 or 3 ambulances dispatched to a high school, and it was they didn't get there in time because they couldn't find the high school, and we didn't know where the ambulances were, and the teenager died as a result. We had 4 parents calling in, I think, from the field. And that's where we start talking about AVL and technology and what's out there. We're really talking about saving lives. I mean, that's the bottom line. That's what we're talking about. And, we also saw from the fires in Northern California that having those redundant systems, we know the first thing in a major disaster, the cellular, is going to go out. And then what? And if we're relying on that information. We also know that we need to make sure, and this is something we should never forget, the technology, no matter how good or what that mapping software is, every firefighter, every paramedic better learn how to read a map. Because the second those systems fail and they pull out a map, I mean, if I gave my kids today a Thomas Brothers, they'd say, "What is that, Dad?" But it was lessons learned from what happened in Northern California. That they're talking about that some of those people didn't even have maps. And I don't mean the first responders, I mean the residents. And so all of a sudden they've got to find their way out of streets that they're not familiar with. And their cellular communications are down. That means they don't have Google Maps, they don't have Waze, they don't have any of that running. They were driving into dead ends and probably resulted in losing lives. So as great as we have the conversation of technology, and I'm one of the biggest tech junkies here. We got to remember the basics too. But so if you can include that in the report, all that information, that would be very helpful.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
I think that's a very good summary, and I'm glad you raised the last point. I'm glad you raised it rather than me. But it is absolutely right. I still remember my phone number from when I was 6 years old. Right now, if you ask me what my home phone number is, I have no idea because it's here. And that's that's wonderful in many ways. But if we don't continue with our training in our fire department so that they know every single street in their area and how to get there and what the fastest routes are and everything else, because they're reliant on some technological solution, that's a failed policy. And so I hope that we won't ever get to that point. As great as all this advance is, human beings have to ultimately be the backup that we rely most on. Mr. Kretz.
Well, just for the record, I have an LA County Thomas Brothers map in my trunk just in case.
You never know. You never know.
But I don't think I've needed it at least for a few years. So.
Did anything else? Okay, so with all that we've hobbled on to this, Mr. Bonin, does that sound like a sensible solution? Is that was our Frankenstein's monster of requests here clear enough? Okay.
30 days is good, June?
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, then all of the stuff we just said will be the action of the committee, and we'll get that report back in 30 days. Anything else? Any other action? Any members? Anything else? Okay. Is there any other action before the committee? Seeing none, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.